Before we start, close your eye. Your brain will create all the visual. Let's start. Most of us have stayed in a hotel at least once in our lives. A place that isn't home, but pretends to be for a night or two. A room that smells unfamiliar. A bed that looks clean, but never feels completely yours. You unpack a little, just enough to convince yourself you belong there for now. And you probably didn't think much about who stayed in that room before you. That's normal. Because if we did, we'd never sleep. Hotels are built on forgetting. Guests come and go. Stories pass through and disappear. Walls absorb laughter, arguments, fear, grief, and then stand quietly as if nothing ever happened. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. But what if a place didn't forget? What if, instead of letting moments fade, it collected them? Layer by layer, year by year, person by person. What if every footstep, every whispered conversation, every final breath stayed exactly where it happened? That's when a hotel stops being just a building. It becomes a witness. And witnesses don't sleep. Welcome to DarkStory Lab. This is Jake, and tonight, we're stepping inside a place where people don't just check in for the night. They leave something of themselves behind. This is the true story of the Stanley Hotel. Long before it became famous for ghosts, rumors, and sleepless nights, the Stanley Hotel was built as a place of healing. In 1909, Freelan Oscar Stanley came to Estes Park, Colorado, searching for clean air. He was dying of tuberculosis, and doctors believed the mountain climate might save his life. It did. Stanley recovered fully, and out of gratitude, he decided to build a grand hotel in the mountains, a place of beauty, of rest, of elegance. Somewhere people could come to recover their health, just as he had. The Stanley Hotel opened in 1909, bright, luxurious, peaceful. No one expected it to become something else. The building itself stood tall against the Rocky Mountains, isolated, but welcoming. Long hallways, high ceilings, hundreds of rooms, wide staircases that echoed when you walked alone. Even now, people describe the same feeling when they first arrive. Not fear. Awareness. A sense that the building is paying attention to you. In the early days, the Stanley was known for its strict rules. No alcohol, no gambling, quiet evenings, proper behavior. It attracted wealthy families, long-term guests, and people recovering from illness. People who stayed for weeks, months, sometimes years. That matters, because places where people stay briefly forget quickly. Places where people linger, remember. One of the most well-known figures associated with the hotel was Flora Stanley, Freeland's wife. She loved the hotel deeply and spent much of her time there, even after her husband passed away. Guests reported seeing her years later, not as an apparition meant to frighten, but as a presence. Piano music drifting through empty rooms, soft footsteps, the feeling of being gently watched, as if someone was making sure everything was in order. Room 217 became infamous long before horror writers paid attention to it. In 1911, a housekeeper named Elizabeth Wilson was injured there when a gas explosion occurred in the room. She survived, but guests after her reported strange experiences. Lights turning on and off, belongings being unpacked when no one was there, the sensation of hands adjusting blankets while they slept, not threatening, intimate. And intimacy is often more unsettling than fear. The Stanley Hotel didn't announce itself as haunted. People noticed it slowly. Guests began sharing similar stories without realizing it. Children speaking to unseen companions. Staff hearing laughter in empty hallways. Guests waking up with the feeling they weren't alone. Always the same detail. No panic, just certainty. Then, in 1974, a man named Stephen King checked into the hotel with his wife. They were the only guests. The hotel was closing for the winter, and the vast building stood nearly empty. Long hallways, empty rooms. Silence so deep it felt heavy. King later described feeling overwhelmed by the space, isolated, watched, trapped inside a place that felt alive. That stay inspired The Shining. But here's what most people miss. Stephen King didn't invent the horror of the Stanley Hotel. He recognized it. And recognition is powerful. Because once a story has a name, people start listening more closely. After The Shining was published, the Stanley's reputation changed. Visitors arrived expecting fear. Expectation sharpened attention. Attention changed experience. That's when the activity intensified. More sightings, more sounds, more shared experiences. Staff members reported hearing children running in the halls late at night. The sound of a ball bouncing, laughter echoing, then stopping abruptly when investigated. Room 401, once reserved for Stanley himself, became another focal point. Guests reported belongings going missing, then reappearing. Lights switching on. The feeling of being observed closely, not maliciously, curiously. The Stanley Hotel never felt angry. It felt occupied. And that's the distinction that matters. Because anger drives action. Occupation suggests permanence. People often ask if the Stanley Hotel is haunted. That's the wrong question. The better question is whether it ever learned how to be empty. I'm going to pause here, not because the story is ending, but because from this point forward, we go deeper into staff testimonies, modern investigations, psychological effects, repeated patterns, and why some guests leave feeling changed even when nothing happens. One of the strangest things about the Stanley Hotel is how rarely people describe being frightened in the way they expect to be. They don't talk about screaming. They don't talk about running. They don't talk about terror that sends them fleeing in the middle of the night. Instead, they talk about something harder to explain, a feeling of being included. Guests often say the hotel doesn't feel abandoned at night. It feels busy, not noisy, not chaotic, just active. Like the building settles into a different rhythm after dark. Staff members who work overnight shifts describe the same thing. The lights don't just flicker randomly. They turn on in places where someone would logically be working. Hallways that were empty moments earlier suddenly feel occupied, not crowded, accounted for. Doors open and close, but never violently. Elevators move between floors with no one inside, stopping briefly as if letting someone off. And then there are the children. Multiple staff members, years apart, have reported hearing children playing in the hotel. Running footsteps, soft laughter, the sound of a game being played just out of sight. When they investigate, there's never anyone there. But the feeling remains. Not fear. Presence. That's the word that comes up again and again. The Stanley Hotel doesn't seem interested in startling people. It doesn't feed on panic or shock. It doesn't stage dramatic moments. It does something quieter. It reminds people they aren't alone. And for some guests, that reminder is comforting. For others, it's deeply unsettling, because comfort implies familiarity, and familiarity implies memory. The hotel remembers. Room 217 continues to be the most requested room, even by people who claim they don't believe in ghosts. Guests stay there out of curiosity, often expecting something dramatic to happen. Most of the time, nothing does. But the guests who leave talking about the room describe the same pattern. They feel watched while they sleep. They wake up suddenly for no reason. Their belongings feel adjusted, not moved far, just corrected. Shoes placed neatly, suitcases closed, lights turned off. The housekeeper who was injured in that room more than a century ago didn't die. She lived a full life afterward. but the room never stopped carrying her routine. That's what unsettles investigators the most. The Stanley Hotel doesn't replay tragedy. It replays habit. Habits repeat without intention. They don't need emotion to persist. They just need time. That suggests something deeply different from the usual idea of haunting. This isn't about souls trapped in pain. It's about patterns embedded so deeply they continue on their own. And a building that old, filled with that many long-term guests, that much routine, that much repetition, it would be strange if nothing lingered. One of the most consistent experiences reported by guests happens in the early hours of the morning, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the hotel is at its quietest. Guests wake up suddenly, feeling alert, as if someone has entered the room. Not threatening, not aggressive, observant. Some say they feel as if they're being checked on. Others describe the sense that they've interrupted something. That's an important detail. Not that something interrupted them, that they interrupted something else. The Stanley Hotel feels like a place where life continues on a schedule that doesn't require living people. Investigators who have spent nights inside the hotel describe an overwhelming sense of order. Activity doesn't feel chaotic or random, it feels structured. Footsteps repeat along the same paths, doors open in the same sequence, sounds occur at consistent times. That consistency is more unsettling than randomness. Random events can be dismissed. Patterns demand explanation. One investigator noted that the hotel felt less like a haunted building and more like a system that never shut down, like a machine still running long after the operator stepped away. That idea explains why people leave the Stanley Hotel feeling altered, even when nothing dramatic occurs. Because being observed changes behavior, even if the observer is never seen. Guests often say they feel compelled to behave differently in the hotel, to speak more softly, the building itself to move carefully from them, to be that expectation weighs on some people more than others. Children tend to notice it immediately. They talk to things adults can't see. They respond to voices no one else hears. Parents often dismiss it as imagination, but children don't carry the same assumptions adults do. They don't need to be convinced that a place can be alive. They simply accept it. The Stanley Hotel doesn't announce itself to children. It interacts. Parents later report their children waving at empty spaces, laughing at unseen companions, refusing to sleep in certain rooms without explanation. And when the families leave, the children stop mentioning it, as if the connection was location-based, as if whatever they were responding to stayed behind. The hotel doesn't follow people home. It doesn't need to. It exists exactly where it is. Waiting. Visitors often ask whether the Stanley Hotel is dangerous. There are no reports of violence linked to the hauntings, no attacks, no harm. That's what makes it difficult to define. Danger usually has an edge. The Stanley Hotel feels rounded, polished, maintained, like a place that expects you to stay. And that expectation is subtle, but powerful, because places that expect you to stay don't want to frighten you away. They want you comfortable. They want you relaxed. They want you to forget the difference between being alone and being accompanied. And once that difference fades, something else begins. People who stay at the Stanley Hotel for more than a few nights often describe a subtle shift in themselves. It doesn't happen immediately. There's no clear moment where they can say, this is when it started. It's gradual. On the first night, the hotel feels impressive, historic, quiet in a way that feels peaceful. On the second night, the silence feels heavier, not uncomfortable, noticeable. By the third night, many guests say they stop noticing the silence altogether. That's when it happens. They begin to feel settled, not relaxed. Settled, as if their presence has been accounted for, as if the building has adjusted to them, Long-term guests in the early days of the hotel stayed for months at a time. They developed routines. Morning walks through the halls, evening conversations in the lounge, repeated movements through the same spaces, day after day. Those routines mattered, because repetition is how places learn us. Staff members who work at the Stanley for years describe a similar effect. New employees often feel uneasy during their first weeks. They hear things they can't explain. They feel watched. But over time, that discomfort fades. Not because the activity stops, because they stop reacting to it. That's the part that concerns investigators the most. The Stanley Hotel doesn't escalate. It normalizes. Workers stop questioning footsteps behind them. They stop turning around when they hear their names spoken softly. They stop wondering why a room they just locked is suddenly open. It becomes part of the environment, like the sound of wind outside, like an old building settling. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible. That's how influence works, not through fear, through familiarity. One longtime employee once said that the hotel felt less haunted and more inhabited, not by anything threatening, but by something consistent, something that had expectations. The building expects quiet at certain hours. It expects respect in certain rooms. It expects routines to be followed. When guests ignore those unspoken rules, that's when the hotel responds. Not violently, correctively. Doors close, lights turn off, noises increase until attention is restored, almost like a reminder that you're not the only one here. Room 401 is a perfect example. It was once the room used by Freelan Oscar Stanley himself. Guests staying there often report a heightened sense of awareness. They feel compelled to behave properly, to keep things neat, to avoid loud conversations. Some report feeling uncomfortable changing clothes, as if privacy were compromised. Others feel reassured, as if someone is making sure they're all right. The same room produces opposite reactions. That suggests something important. The experience isn't imposed, it's reflected. The Stanley Hotel seems to amplify whatever you bring with you. Anxious guests feel watched. Calm guests feel accompanied. Skeptical guests feel nothing at all. That inconsistency frustrates people looking for proof. But it makes perfect sense if the hotel isn't projecting anything outward, if it's responding inward. Investigators who approach the hotel aggressively often leave disappointed. Equipment records little. Activity remains minimal. The building feels inert. But those who approach quietly, patiently, respectfully, often experience more. Not because they're trying harder, because they're listening. The Stanley Hotel doesn't reward intrusion. It responds to attention given without demand. There's a difference between wanting something to happen and being open to noticing what already is. That difference changes everything. Guests who spend time alone in the hotel often report the strongest experiences, not because they're more vulnerable, but because solitude strips away distraction. Without conversation, without noise, without movement, the building has space to be felt. Not seen, felt. People describe it as standing near someone who is quietly watching you read, not interacting, not interrupting, just there. That presence becomes more noticeable the longer you stay, and for some people it becomes comforting. That's when the danger, if you want to call it that, appears. Not danger of harm, danger of attachment. People begin to feel like they belong at the Stanley Hotel, like the place understands them, like it offers a kind of quiet companionship they don't find elsewhere. Leaving feels strange. Some guests report sadness when they check out, a reluctance they can't explain, a sense that they're abandoning something. That reaction is rare in hotels, but it happens here. And it has been happening for over a century, which raises a question no one likes to ask. What happens when a place becomes better at holding people than the outside world? The Stanley Hotel doesn't trap anyone physically. The doors are open. The roads lead away. But attachment doesn't require walls. It requires familiarity. It requires routine. It requires a place that remembers you when you return. Guests who revisit the Stanley Hotel after years away often describe the same feeling. Recognition. Not nostalgia. Recognition. As if the building knows they've been here before. As if something has been waiting. And waiting, as history shows us, is something this place does very well. Modern investigations into the Stanley Hotel didn't begin with a desire to prove anything supernatural. They began because of consistency. Decades apart, people who had never met each other described the same experiences in almost identical language. Not dramatic encounters, not terrifying visions, subtle moments that felt personal rather than theatrical. Security cameras captured empty hallways lighting up in sequence, as if someone were walking through them. Motion sensors triggered without temperature changes or airflow shifts. Audio recordings picked up faint music in rooms where no instruments were present. Always the same detail. Nothing lingered long enough to be dramatic. It was as if whatever occupied the hotel understood the line between being noticed and being questioned, and chose to remain just on the safer side of it. Investigators who spent extended time in the building noticed something else. The activity wasn't evenly distributed. Certain areas felt heavier, not darker, not colder, more attentive. The grand staircase, the concert hall, the long central corridors, places designed for gathering, places where people once waited. Waiting rooms are strange environments. They hold anticipation, uncertainty, the quiet tension of people preparing for what comes next. The Stanley Hotel is full of them. Guests describe feeling most watched when standing still, when pausing at the end of a hallway, when sitting quietly in a chair with nothing to do but think. Movement seems to disrupt whatever rhythm exists there. Stillness invites it. One investigator remarked that the hotel behaved like an audience more than a performer. It didn't put on a show. It watched people go about their routines. That perspective changed how the experiences were interpreted. Instead of asking, "What is it doing?" investigators began asking, "What is it observing?" That question led to an unsettling realization. The Stanley Hotel feels most active when guests behave as if they belong, not tourists rushing through, not skeptics challenging it, but people who settle in, people who unpack, people who linger in common areas, people who follow routines. Those behaviors mirror the original guests who stayed for long periods while recovering from illness. People in transition, people waiting for their lives to resume. The hotel learned that rhythm. It learned how people occupy space when they don't know how long they'll be there. That's why the presence feels patient. It's familiar with waiting. Some guests report that after several nights, they begin to feel protective of the hotel, annoyed when others are loud, uncomfortable when rules are broken, as if they've taken on the role of caretaker without realizing it. That shift in perspective is subtle but significant. It suggests identification. And identification is how environments influence behavior. The Stanley Hotel doesn't need to scare people. It encourages them to conform, to slow down, to quiet themselves, to adapt to its pace. Once that happens, experiences intensify. People report hearing their names spoken softly when no one is nearby, feeling someone pass behind them in narrow corridors, sensing attention in rooms where they are alone. Not threatening attention. Evaluative, like being checked on. This sensation often disappears the moment the guest reacts strongly. Fear breaks the connection. So does anger. Calm keeps it intact. That explains why emotionally steady guests experience more than anxious ones. Anxiety introduces noise. Calm creates clarity. Investigators who approach the hotel with reverence rather than excitement report stronger impressions. They speak softly. They move slowly. They don't provoke. And the hotel responds. Lights illuminate ahead of them. Sounds echo just out of sight. Doors open without force, always controlled, never chaotic. This consistency led some researchers to abandon the word haunting entirely. They began referring to the Stanley Hotel as an environment with memory. Not conscious memory. Procedural memory. The kind that persists through repetition. Just as a pianist's fingers remember movements long after the mind forgets the notes. The hotel remembers routines, footsteps at certain hours, doors opening in sequence, music played at specific times. Flora Stanley was known to play the piano in the hotel regularly. Guests today report hearing soft piano music drifting through empty rooms, not complete melodies, fragments, the same way memories surface. Incomplete, but unmistakable. People often ask whether Flora Stanley's presence is responsible for the hotel's atmosphere. That question oversimplifies things. She may be part of the pattern. But patterns rarely have single origins. The Stanley Hotel is more like a tapestry woven from hundreds of lives. Long stays, repeated movements, quiet moments layered on top of one another. Over time, those layers become difficult to separate, and separation may not even matter, because whatever exists there now doesn't behave like an individual spirit. It behaves like a system that notices when someone new enters, a system that adjusts when someone stays, a system that doesn't forget. And systems don't need intention to influence, they only need consistency. That's what makes the Stanley Hotel unsettling in a way that defies easy explanation. It doesn't feel haunted by the past, it feels occupied by it. One of the most unsettling reports connected to the Stanley Hotel comes not from what happens inside the building, but from what follows people after they leave. Guests rarely say they were followed home by anything concrete. No apparitions, no shadows and mirrors, no dramatic events that would make a good story at a dinner table. What they describe is quieter. They say the world outside feels louder than it should, that ordinary spaces feel strangely empty, that silence no longer feels neutral. Some report missing the hotel, not the location, not the view, the feeling. As if something there had been paying attention to them, and now that attention was gone. That reaction confused psychologists who studied similar reports. Humans don't usually feel attached to buildings unless something meaningful happened there. A memory, a relationship, a moment of transformation. But many guests insist nothing significant occurred. They slept, they walked the halls, they left. And yet, something stayed with them. Investigators began to suspect that the Stanley Hotel doesn't imprint itself through events, but through rhythm, through the way it slows people down and aligns them to its pace. Most of modern life is fast, disconnected, fragmented, attention pulled in too many directions at once. The Stanley Hotel does the opposite. It isolates. It quiets. It encourages long stretches of thought without interruption. That alone can feel profound. But when combined with a place that holds more than a century of layered human presence, the effect deepens. Guests begin to feel seen, not judged. Seen. And being seen, truly seen, is something many people don't experience often. That might explain why some guests feel reluctant to leave. Why checking out feels like stepping away from something that understood them better than most places do. That's not a haunting. That's attachment. And attachment doesn't require anything supernatural. It requires attention and consistency. The Stanley Hotel offers both. Staff members notice this effect most clearly in guests who arrive alone. Writers, artists, people in transition, people searching for quiet. Those guests often linger in common areas long after others have gone to bed, sitting, thinking, watching the light change in the halls. They are the ones most likely to report experiences, not fear. Communication. They feel acknowledged, a subtle shift in awareness, like someone listening without interrupting. And once you experience that kind of attention, the absence of it can feel like loss. That's why the Stanley Hotel doesn't need to trap anyone. It lets people leave, because it knows many of them will return. Guests who come back often report something that borders on unsettling familiarity. They know where to turn without checking signs. They choose the same seats without realizing why. They fall into routines they don't remember forming, as if the hotel remembers them, as if it kept their place. Investigators argue about whether that sensation is psychological suggestion or something more. But suggestion itself requires cooperation. The mind has to be receptive, and the Stanley Hotel seems particularly good at encouraging receptivity, not through fear, through calm. Calm lowers defenses. Calm invites introspection, and introspection opens doors people didn't know were there. That's why the most intense experiences rarely happen during ghost tours or investigations filled with equipment and excitement. They happen late at night, when the hotel is quiet. When someone sits alone and lets their thoughts wander, that's when the building feels closest. Not looming, present. Guests describe it as the sensation of sharing space with someone who has already accepted you. No need for introductions, no need for permission, just coexistence. That coexistence is what stays with people long after they've gone. It changes how they think about empty spaces, about silence, about being alone. Some find it comforting, others find it deeply unsettling. Because once you realize a place can notice you, it becomes harder to believe you're ever truly unseen. And that idea doesn't stay confined to one hotel. It spreads. Over time, the reputation of the Stanley Hotel stopped being about ghosts in the traditional sense. People didn't come looking for apparitions anymore. They came looking for a feeling. They asked the staff questions that were difficult to answer directly. Not, "Have you seen anything?" But, "Does it feel different at night?" Not, "Is it haunted?" But, "Why do people keep coming back?" And the staff, especially those who had been there the longest, struggled to explain it without sounding vague. Because the truth wasn't dramatic. The truth was gradual. The Stanley Hotel doesn't overwhelm you with fear. It acclimates you to itself. It introduces itself slowly, the way a place does when you stay long enough for it to stop being new. The building teaches you how to move through it, how loudly to speak, where to pause, when to stop walking and just stand. Guests often don't realize this is happening until they leave. That's when the difference becomes clear. Outside the hotel, the world feels rushed, distracted, disconnected. Inside the hotel, time seems to fold in on itself, not slowing exactly, thickening. Moments stretch. Silences last longer than expected. Thoughts linger instead of dissolving. This is why so many writers and artists are drawn to the Stanley Hotel. Stephen King wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last. Creative people often describe the hotel as receptive, like it holds space for ideas without demanding anything in return. That receptiveness feels generous. But receptiveness can also feel invasive if you aren't prepared for it. Because when a place gives you space to think, it also gives you space to notice things you usually avoid. Your own thoughts, your own fears, your own unresolved questions. The Stanley Hotel doesn't put those things there. It removes the noise that keeps them buried. And that's why the experiences differ so widely from person to person. Someone carrying grief may feel watched, because grief heightens awareness. Someone seeking peace may feel comforted because quiet feels like relief. The hotel reflects, not intentionally, consistently. Investigators who stayed for extended periods noticed something else that challenged their assumptions. The longer they stayed, the less they felt like observers, and the more they felt like participants. They stopped looking for activity and started responding to it naturally, adjusting their routines, avoiding certain spaces at certain times, choosing particular paths through the building without conscious reasoning. That shift didn't feel imposed. It felt reasonable. That's what made it dangerous to ignore, because reasonable adjustments don't trigger alarm bells. They feel like personal choice. Over time, investigators realized they were adapting to the hotel more than it was adapting to them. The building wasn't changing. They were. That realization marked a turning point in how the Stanley Hotel was discussed among serious researchers. The question was no longer, is something here? The question became, what happens when a place has had more time to learn people than people have had to learn it? The Stanley Hotel has stood for more than a century. It has watched thousands of lives pass through it. It has absorbed routines, habits, conversations, arguments, recoveries, departures. People leave traces without realizing it, not physical traces, behavioral ones. And when enough of those traces overlap, something resembling continuity forms. Not consciousness. Continuity. The hotel doesn't need to think. It only needs to persist. Guests sometimes say the Stanley feels like it's listening. That may not be literally true, but it feels accurate. And feelings shape behavior more reliably than facts. That's why the hotel doesn't need to frighten people to make an impression. It leaves them thoughtful. And thoughtfulness is fertile ground, because when people think deeply in a place, they associate that depth with the environment itself. They return seeking it again. That return reinforces the pattern. The Stanley Hotel doesn't trap memories, it invites them. And invitations are harder to resist than threats. What ultimately separates the Stanley Hotel from other so-called haunted places is that it never seems interested in leaving. Most ghost stories revolve around movement, spirits that wander, presences that follow people home, energy that attaches itself and refuses to let go. The Stanley Hotel does the opposite. It stays exactly where it is. Guests don't feel chased, they feel released. And that difference matters. People often assume that if a place is truly haunted, it would want more. More fear, more attention, more control. But the Stanley never behaves that way. It doesn't cling. It doesn't pursue. It allows people to go, which makes the attachment that forms feel voluntary. Guests who leave and feel unsettled often struggle to explain why. They weren't frightened out of the building. They weren't overwhelmed. Nothing dramatic forced them away. They simply left. And afterward, they noticed the absence. That absence can feel heavier than presence, because presence is something you adapt to. Absence reminds you that something existed at all. Investigators believe this is why the Stanley Hotel's influence ends at its doors. Not because it can't go further, but because it doesn't need to. Its power, if that's the right word, comes from being a constant, a fixed point, a place that exists outside the rush of ordinary life. When people step inside, they adjust to its pace. When they leave, the world feels misaligned for a while. That misalignment fades, but the memory of it doesn't. People remember how clearly they thought there, how deeply they slept, or how vividly they dreamed, how silence felt full instead of empty. They remember feeling observed without being judged. That combination is rare, and rarity creates significance. The Stanley Hotel doesn't need to follow anyone because people carry the comparison with them. Every quiet place afterward is measured against it, Every empty hallway feels different. The hotel becomes a reference point, not for fear, for awareness. That's why so many people return. Not because they want answers, because they want that feeling again. And every return strengthens the pattern. Guests who come back after years often describe a strange sense of continuity. They don't feel like newcomers. They feel resumed, as if the pause button was pressed when they left and released when they returned. That sensation doesn't require anything supernatural to exist. It requires memory. And memory is something places are very good at holding, especially places built for waiting. The Stanley Hotel was designed for people who were recovering, resting, or transitioning. People who didn't know how long they would stay. People suspended between one chapter and the next. That energy never left. It simply layered. Year after year. Guest after guest. Until the hotel became very good at holding people in between. Between movement and stillness. Between fear and comfort. Between arrival and departure. That's where most of the experiences happen. Not at the extremes. In the middle. And the middle is where people are most receptive. The Stanley Hotel doesn't scare people into believing. It gives them time to notice. And noticing is the first step toward attachment. Whether you call that haunting or not depends on what you believe a haunting is supposed to be. But belief may not matter as much as people think, because the hotel doesn't ask for belief. It only asks that you slow down long enough to feel it. And most people do, even if they don't realize it. Eventually, the question stops being whether the Stanley Hotel is haunted. People who stay long enough realize that question doesn't fit. Haunting implies intrusion, something foreign, something that doesn't belong. The Stanley Hotel doesn't feel foreign to itself. It feels complete. That's the realization many guests reach quietly, usually late at night, when they're sitting alone and the building settles around them. When the sounds soften. When the hallways stretch out in front of them, unchanged, unhurried. The hotel doesn't react to them in that moment. It simply continues. And that continuity is what feels unsettling. Because most things in our lives are temporary. People move on. Places change. Buildings are renovated, demolished, replaced. Very little stays exactly as it was long enough to feel permanent. The Stanley Hotel does. It has endured illness, recovery, grief, celebration, isolation, creativity, and abandonment without losing its rhythm. That rhythm doesn't demand attention. It waits for it. Guests who sense this often describe a moment where the hotel feels less like a location and more like a state of mind, a place where thoughts slow down whether you want them to or not, where distractions fall away. In that stillness, people become more aware of themselves, and that awareness can be uncomfortable, because silence reveals things, unfinished conversations, lingering regrets, questions you've avoided asking. The Stanley Hotel doesn't create those thoughts. It gives them space. That's why the experiences are so personal. Why one guest feels comfort and another feels unease in the same room. The building isn't projecting. It's reflecting. Over time, this reflection becomes associated with the place itself. People stop saying, "I felt this way," and start saying, "The hotel made me feel this way." That shift matters, because it means the environment has become part of the experience. And once a place becomes part of how you process your inner world, it gains influence. Not control. Influence. The Stanley Hotel never crosses the line into control. It doesn't force thoughts. It doesn't trap people. It doesn't follow them home. It simply remains consistent long enough for people to notice themselves more clearly than they usually do. That's why it doesn't need ghosts that appear on command. It doesn't need dramatic events. Its power comes from patience, from being exactly what it has always been, while the world around it rushes forward. People leave the Stanley Hotel changed, not because something happened to them there, but because something slowed down enough for them to feel it. And slowing down is rare, which makes it memorable. That memory is what gives the hotel its reputation. Not a single apparition, not a single story, but the accumulation of thousands of quiet experiences layered on top of each other. That's why the Stanley Hotel doesn't care if people believe in ghosts. Belief fades. Experience stays. Guests may forget details, but they remember how it felt to be there, how silence carried weight, how being alone didn't feel empty. They remember that the building didn't ignore them, and that memory is enough to bring them back, or at least to think about it long after they've gone. That's the final truth beneath all the stories. The Stanley Hotel doesn't haunt people, it stays with them. And staying is far more powerful than chasing. If this story stayed with you, if it made you slow down for a moment longer than you expected, that's what DarkStory Lab is about. We don't chase loud horror here. We explore the kind that settles in quietly, the kind rooted in real places, real history, and real human experience. If you want more true horror stories like this, stories that don't rely on monsters, but on what people feel when they're truly alone, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you want the next story, let me know by liking this video and sharing it with someone who listens late at night. This is Jake. Thank you for being here. And remember, some places don't follow you when you leave. They don't have to. They stay with you.